The Great Council at the Longhouse. Picture it centuries ago, before colonists had carved their way across the continent. The nations of the Northeast gathered in a longhouse so vast it seemed to stretch beyond the limits of sight. This was no ordinary gathering. It was the birth of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the great law of peace that would bind together the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, and later the Tuscarora. The air was thick with smoke from council fires, the scent of cedar and sage clinging to every robe and every word. Chiefs and clan mothers sat side by side, for here both men and women held the power to shape destiny. At the center stood the peacemaker, speaking of unity, of ending the endless cycles of blood feud and vengeance. His words painted a vision. Nations bound not by conquest, but by respect, justice, and shared law. Each wampum belt laid before the council was not just a record, but a contract, a memory carved in shell and thread that no tongue could ever erase. Voices rose in debate, some hot with anger, some cautious with doubt. But the fire burned steadily, and the promise of peace shone brighter than the embers. In time, hands clasped across divides, and the people agreed. They would bury their weapons beneath the great tree of peace, its roots stretching in all four directions, its branches sheltering every nation willing to live by its laws. From that day, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy stood as one of the greatest political unions in history, so strong that even the framers of the U.S. Constitution would later study its ways. That first great meeting, inside the Longhouse and under the great tree, was more than a pact. It was proof that peace could be chosen over war, and that unity could outlast the sharpest blade. The year was 1851, and the plains stretched endless, the horizon broken only by the herds of buffalo and the lodges of nations who had called this land home, since time immemorial. Along the banks of Horse Creek, near Fort Laramie, one of the greatest gatherings in Native history unfolded. Nearly 10,000 men, women, and children from tribes across the West came together. Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Crow, Assiniboine, Mandan, Hidatsa, Arikara, and more. Imagine the sight. Teepees dotting the valley like stars fallen to earth, fires glowing under the vast dome of sky, drums echoing in the night as horses whinnied and children laughed. This was not just a meeting, it was a sea of nations, each one fierce in its own right, now sitting side by side. The U.S. officials arrived too, with promises inked on parchment. But it was the voices of the chiefs that filled the air with true weight. They spoke of hunting grounds, of trails cut across their homelands, of peace they wished to keep, but would fight to defend. The negotiations stretched long, words clashing as hard as steel, yet the council fires burned steadily, demanding resolution. At last the Treaty of Fort Laramie, what many call the Treaty at Horse Creek, was signed. It promised peace among the tribes and between the native nations and the settlers. It recognized vast territories for each people, stretching from the Black Hills to the Platte River. Though history would later show how quickly those promises were broken, the meeting itself was a moment of power. Native nations united in voice, presenting themselves not as scattered tribes, but as sovereign peoples with dignity and strength. On those days by Horse Creek, the land itself seemed to hold its breath, witnessing one of the greatest councils ever to rise from the heartbeat of the plains. The year was 1867, and the winds of the southern plains carried tension heavy as thunderclouds. Along Medicine Lodge Creek in what is now Kansas, thousands gathered for one of the most consequential councils in Native history. The U.S. government sent commissioners, soldiers, and interpreters. Waiting for them were the great nations of the southern plains: Kiowa, Comanche, Apache, Cheyenne, and Arapaho. Picture the scene. Warriors on painted horses lined the ridges, women setting up teepees along the creek, children darting between fires as elders looked on with measured eyes. Chiefs dressed in feathers and beadwork stepped forward, proud and unyielding. This was not a gathering of submission, but of nations defending their homelands with every word spoken. The council opened with speeches that cut like arrows. Chiefs declared their bond with the land, that the rivers, the buffalo, and the wide prairie were theirs from the beginning of time. Satanta, the Kiowa chief, rose with words still remembered. A long time ago, this land belonged to our fathers. But when I go up to the river, I see camps of soldiers, and when I look around, I see more soldiers. Why is it? His voice echoed the pain of every nation present. Days passed with tense negotiations. Promises of food, schools, and reservations were laid out, but suspicion hung thick in the air. Finally, treaties were signed. Treaties meant to bring peace, but ones that carved away at ancestral lands. Though the promises would soon be broken, the council at Medicine Lodge Creek stands as one of the greatest meetings because of its defiance, its passion, and its attempt to protect a way of life under siege. The prairie that day was more than a backdrop. It was a witness, holding the memory of chiefs who stood tall, unbending, against the tide of change. The summer of 1876 burned hot across the northern plains. The buffalo herds were thinning, soldiers pushed deeper into native lands, and the U.S. government demanded the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho abandon the Black Hills. Instead, the nations gathered in defiance. Along the valleys near the Little Bighorn River, the greatest council of the Plains peoples rose like a storm on the horizon. Picture the scene. Hundreds of lodges stretching across the grasslands, smoke spiraling into the wide sky. Warriors painted for war sat in circles. Women prepared food for the gathered nations, and elders lifted prayers into the wind. The Lakota leader Sitting Bull presided over a sun dance that filled the camp with power. In a vision, he saw soldiers falling into the village like grasshoppers, a sign that victory was close. The council fires burned long into the night. Voices clashed in debate. Some chiefs urged caution, fearing the endless march of soldiers, while others demanded to fight for every hill and river that was theirs by birthright. Crazy Horse spoke little, but his presence alone was a promise of action. The Cheyenne and Arapaho, too, lent their strength, knowing the struggle belonged to all. This was not just a meeting, it was the gathering of a nation in defense of its soul. When the decision was made to stand and fight, the people moved as one. Days later, that